A new beginning. The unseen hero. The car slowly came to a halt in front of the lavish hotel. The black luxury sedan gleamed under the warm rays of the sun, its polished surface reflecting the image of the towering structure that rose above it. Danielle exhaled sharply as she stared up at the building. A landmark in the heart of the city, its pristine facade boasting a mix of modern glass and classical architecture. She adjusted her collar and tugged at the sleeves of her plain janitor uniform, making sure the disguise was flawless. She could feel the nerves creeping up her spine as she stepped out of the vehicle, her shoes clicking softly against the sidewalk. There was no turning back now. This was her assignment, her chance to gather the crucial intelligence that could break open a massive criminal syndicate operating in the underbelly of the city. Her mission: to infiltrate the hotel as a lowly janitor, observe the guests, and gather whatever information she could on the secret meetings that were rumored to take place within the hotel's walls. Danielle had been in tough situations before. As an FBI agent, she had worked in high-risk environments, dangerous undercover operations, violent criminal organizations, and heart-pounding high-speed chases. But this felt different. For the first time in her career, she was about to be seen for something she was not. Not as an FBI agent, not as a skilled operative, but as someone invisible, someone who was expected to be looked down upon and underestimated. She walked toward the entrance, the weight of each step grounding her deeper into her role. Danielle knew what people saw when they looked at her. A black woman working as a janitor in a high-end hotel. She had always been acutely aware of how the world perceived her, of how her race shaped every interaction. Her appearance alone, with her tightly coiled hair tucked into a simple cap and the faint scent of cleaning supplies trailing behind her, would ensure she went unnoticed by most. It was a tactical advantage. Being invisible meant she could watch, listen, and gather information without raising suspicion. But it also came with its own set of challenges. The subtle yet biting sting of judgment, the whispers of those who assumed she didn't belong in a place like this, or worse, the cold stares of those who believed that someone like her was only fit for the role of a cleaner, a worker, someone to be dismissed without a second thought. Danielle braced herself for the inevitable. She had faced prejudice before. It had been part of her life from the moment she could remember. From the time she was a child and was told she was too loud, too aggressive, or too outspoken. From the subtle discrimination at school to the overt racism she had encountered throughout her career. She had learned to brush it off, to rise above it, to prove herself time and time again. But this situation was different. Infiltrating a criminal operation meant keeping her emotions in check, keeping the focus on the job, and not on the hurtful things people might say or think about her. As she entered the hotel's grand lobby, the first thing that struck her was the opulence. The marble floors gleamed, polished to perfection. Massive chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting soft, golden light across the room. Plush furniture lined the edges, and the reception desk stood like an island in a sea of luxurious decor. Guests walked through the lobby, dressed in expensive suits and gowns, chatting in hushed tones as they moved with an air of superiority. Their laughter echoed in the background, but Danielle was hardly noticed. She blended into the background like a shadow, as was her purpose. But then something caught her eye, a figure standing near the reception desk. It was the hotel manager, Mr. Griffin. He was tall, with sharp features, and a meticulously groomed appearance. The air of control and authority around him was palpable. He had the kind of look that said he knew everyone, that he ran the show. And in many ways, he did. As the hotel manager, he had the power to make or break a guest's experience. He was the type of person who gave off an air of importance, as if he held all the answers to the world's problems. And yet there was something about the way he looked at her that sent a chill down Danielle's spine. His eyes seemed to scrutinize her from the moment she stepped into his line of sight, a sharpness in his gaze that felt like a judgment, a dismissal. Danielle had encountered this look before. People often judged her based on the way she looked, assuming things about her before they even knew her name. It was the way the world worked, after all. People were quick to judge and even quicker to draw conclusions, and her race was a big part of that equation. But what made her uneasy wasn't just his cold stare. It was the sense of superiority that oozed from him. As she quietly mopped the floor nearby, her eyes darted around the room, scanning for any sign of suspicious activity. This was the heart of her mission, after all. She had to be vigilant, focused on the task at hand. Yet Mr. Griffin's gaze remained fixed on her, and it was impossible to ignore. He stared at her as though she were beneath him, like she didn't belong in the same space as the high-end clientele that passed through the lobby. She could feel his judgment even without words. It was a look she had seen many times before in her life. The look that said, "You're not supposed to be here." She could tell that he had already made up his mind about her. To him, she wasn't Danielle, an undercover FBI agent on an important mission. She was just another janitor, someone whose presence was an inconvenience, someone who didn't belong in a place like this. Danielle continued with her task, ignoring the man's stare. She had been trained to deal with situations like this, to not let personal biases or judgments derail her focus. But the longer she worked, the more she could feel the weight of his gaze pressing down on her. His eyes never left her, and soon the whispers started. "Who let her in here?" Someone muttered, their voice laced with thinly veiled disdain. Danielle didn't have to look up to know they were talking about her. The words stung, but she kept her head down, continuing to mop the floor in slow, deliberate strokes. She had been through worse, after all. Being a black woman in a predominantly white institution, especially in law enforcement, meant facing these subtle indignities every day. But today, it was different. Today, it wasn't just a passing glance or a hushed whisper. It was an entire atmosphere of exclusion, a concerted effort to make her feel small and insignificant. Her heart beat faster as Mr. Griffin approached her. His footsteps were heavy and deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. He stopped just short of her, looking down at her with a mixture of condescension and thinly veiled disgust. "What do you think you're doing here?" he asked, his voice sharp and filled with disdain. "You don't belong in a place like this." Danielle's mind raced, but she kept her composure. She had to. There was no room for error. "I'm just doing my job, sir," she replied evenly, forcing the words out despite the tension that coiled in her chest. Mr. Griffin's face twisted with disdain. "That's the problem," he sneered. "People like you don't belong here. We don't need someone like you loitering around, making the guests uncomfortable." His words rang out, loud enough for several guests to hear. Danielle stood frozen. She had been through worse, and she had heard these kinds of words before. But this was different. This wasn't just an ignorant remark from a stranger. This was coming from someone in power, someone who had the ability to shape perceptions, to create a toxic atmosphere of exclusion. The humiliation was unbearable, but she clenched her fists, reminding herself that she had a mission to complete. The weight of this moment wasn't lost on her. It was a battle of dignity, but she knew she had to keep her cool, even when every fiber of her being wanted to lash out. And that's when Mr. Griffin crossed the line. "Get her out of here," he barked, his voice louder than before. Within moments, 2 security guards appeared, rushing toward her. They didn't question the order. They grabbed her by the arm, pulling her away from the scene. Danielle could feel the eyes of the guests on her as she was escorted out. Some watched with pity, others with a judgment that stung even more. She had been publicly humiliated, reduced to nothing more than an invisible janitor in their eyes. But as she stepped through the hotel's revolving door, something shifted inside her. There was a small glimmer of satisfaction, the realization that she had just been underestimated in the most profound way possible. Danielle couldn't help but smirk as the door swung shut behind her. Little did Mr. Griffin know, the tables were about to turn, and he would soon learn the hard way that he had made the greatest mistake of his life. Rebuilding strength. The calm before the storm. As the door of the hotel swung shut behind her, Danielle stood in the cool evening air, still processing the humiliation she had just endured. The weight of the public scene, the way Mr. Griffin had stripped her of any dignity in front of the guests, hung heavily on her chest. Her breath was shallow, and her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She had been humiliated, no doubt about that. But there was also a fire igniting deep within her, a surge of anger that hadn't quite reached the surface yet. The wind blew gently against her face, cooling the flush of embarrassment that had spread across her skin. She took a slow breath, reminding herself of the purpose behind it all. This wasn't just about personal pride. It was about something far bigger. This wasn't the first time she had faced racial profiling, nor would it be the last. But it was the first time that her humiliation had the potential to make a true difference. She had never felt more certain that the moment had arrived for change to happen. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, interrupting her thoughts. Danielle pulled it out and saw the message from Special Agent Francis. "Get back to HQ now. We need to discuss next steps." Francis was the special agent in charge of this covert operation, and he was as determined as Danielle was to bring down the criminal network operating out of that hotel. He had always had a way of making her feel like part of something bigger, part of a team, and that sense of camaraderie was something she desperately needed right now. She slid into her car, the engine purring to life as she pulled out of the parking lot. The drive back to the FBI headquarters felt longer than usual, her mind spinning with the thoughts of what had just transpired. The events of the day weighed heavily on her, but she couldn't afford to let it consume her. She had a job to finish. Upon arriving at the headquarters, Danielle was met by her team. Special Agent Francis, along with a few other colleagues, was already gathered in the briefing room, the atmosphere thick with tension. Danielle entered, her uniform now exchanged for her standard FBI attire. Dark slacks, a crisp white blouse, and her badge proudly pinned to her chest. She took her seat at the table, her eyes scanning the room for signs of how the team was feeling. Everyone knew that this wasn't just about getting information on a criminal network. It was now about exposing an abuse of power, about righting a wrong that had been done to her, and to countless others who had been judged based solely on their appearance. The team looked at her with a mix of concern and determination. Francis leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "Danielle, I know what you've been through today. It's unacceptable, but you need to remember one thing. This isn't just about you. This is about making sure that no one, not one single person, gets away with the kind of treatment you face today." Danielle nodded. She had known going into this mission that her race could play a role in how people perceived her, but she never expected it to happen so brazenly, so publicly. And now, with this incident weighing heavily on her, she was more determined than ever to see this mission through. She knew what she had to do next. She had to rise above it, not just for her own sake, but for the larger cause. The system needed to be held accountable, and she was going to make sure it was. Francis looked at her, his expression softened but resolute. "We're going to make sure Griffin pays for what he did. We've got a chance to turn this around, Danielle. We can use this to expose him. We can make a statement, not just for you, but for every single person who's been mistreated and humiliated because of their race." Danielle took in his words, her pulse quickening. This wasn't just another mission anymore. This was personal. The FBI wasn't just targeting criminals, it was taking aim at a societal issue that had been ignored for far too long. "We're going to go after him," she said firmly, the fire of resolve in her voice. "But we're going to do it the right way. We need the evidence to back it up, and we need to make sure we bring him down not just as a criminal, but as someone who thought he could escape the consequences of his own actions." Later that evening, Danielle found herself in front of a computer in the FBI's operations room, scrolling through the details of the mission. She pored over the intel, the pictures, the notes she had taken during her time undercover at the hotel. Everything had to be perfect. She needed to gather every scrap of information about the criminal activities that were taking place in the hotel. There could be no loose ends. As she clicked through various files and security footage, something caught her eye. One of the hotel's security cameras had captured a meeting that took place in one of the hotel's penthouse suites. The footage wasn't clear enough to make out faces, but the images showed a group of men in suits, clearly engaged in a heated discussion. They had used one of the hotel's most private areas, a place where only high-profile guests had access. Danielle's mind raced. This could be the break they needed, the critical piece of evidence to tie the hotel's management directly to the criminal activity they had been investigating. But she knew it would take time to uncover exactly what was going on in those meetings, and she needed to be careful. She couldn't afford to blow her cover or alert anyone to the fact that she was watching them. The FBI agents who worked alongside her were already working tirelessly to gather more information on the operation, but they needed her to keep her focus on the hotel itself. This was the dangerous part of the mission, the part that required patience and persistence. Danielle would have to go back to the hotel, blending in as the invisible janitor once again, while carefully documenting the activities around her. But this time, she wasn't going in alone. Her team would be monitoring her every move, communicating with her through encrypted devices. They had her back, and that made all the difference. For the first time since she'd been humiliated earlier that day, Danielle felt a surge of strength. Strength in her team, in her purpose, and in the knowledge that this mission wasn't just about completing a task. It was about righting the wrongs that had been done, about sending a message that those who abused their power would face consequences. Danielle's thoughts were interrupted by a message from Francis. "We've got a plan. Meet at the hotel tomorrow. Let's make this count." The mission was far from over, and the stakes had just gotten higher. Danielle knew that the path ahead would be dangerous, but she was ready. She had made it this far, and now she had the chance to make her voice heard, to stand up not just for herself, but for anyone who had ever been judged or dismissed because of the color of their skin. She looked at the clock. It was late, but sleep was elusive tonight. Tomorrow would be a new day, one filled with challenges, but also with the promise of justice. She would go back into that hotel, into the very lion's den that had humiliated her. And when she did, she would return as someone far more powerful than anyone could have ever imagined. Tomorrow, she would take the fight to the next level. And this time, Mr. Griffin and those like him would have nowhere to hide. The return. A storm approaches. The air felt heavier the next morning as Danielle prepared for her return to the hotel. The events of the previous day, her public humiliation at the hands of Mr. Griffin, had given her a sense of urgency. Every fiber of her being ached for justice, not just for herself, but for the countless others who had been unjustly treated and made to feel invisible. Her mission was no longer about collecting intelligence on a criminal network operating in a luxury hotel. It was now about exposing the systemic abuse of power and the dehumanization that came with it. She had a personal stake in this now, and she wasn't about to back down. Danielle stood in front of the mirror in her hotel room, fixing her FBI badge to her belt, her mind racing with the steps she needed to take. She had carefully gone over the plan the night before with Special Agent Francis and the team. Today would be the pivotal day, when the tables would turn and the man who had humiliated her would feel the weight of his own actions. Today, she would walk into that hotel not as an invisible janitor, but as an empowered federal agent, fully backed by the force of the law. She was going to take control of her narrative and show Mr. Griffin the true cost of his arrogance. Her phone buzzed with a message from Francis. "Meet us at the front entrance in 30 minutes. This is it." Danielle took a deep breath, her resolve hardening like steel. This wasn't just about going back to finish the job. It was about taking a stand. She had already faced Mr. Griffin's harsh judgment, but now it was his turn to face the consequences of his actions. She dressed in the dark, professional clothes of a federal agent, clothes that made her feel like she was ready for whatever the day would throw at her. The transition from janitor to federal agent wasn't just about a change of attire. It was about embracing her power, her identity, and the justice she was about to deliver. The hotel loomed ahead, its pristine exterior gleaming under the mid-morning sun. The luxury cars were lined up at the entrance, the guests arriving in droves, oblivious to the storm that was about to hit. As Danielle walked toward the entrance, the familiar sense of being invisible crept back into her chest. But today, it didn't matter. Today, she would walk through those doors and command the space like she owned it. She met Francis and the rest of her team at the designated location. The team was small but efficient, a tactical unit ready for whatever lay ahead. Francis, who had been Danielle's mentor for years, gave her a nod of reassurance. He had seen her grow from a rookie agent to the sharp, calculated operative she was today, and he knew what was at stake for her personally. "You ready?" he asked, his voice low, the weight of their mission settling in. Danielle's gaze hardened, her eyes fixed on the hotel's entrance. "I've been ready since yesterday," she replied, her voice unwavering. Together, the team moved with precision, each member taking their place, communicating through encrypted earpieces. They were ready for the confrontation with Mr. Griffin, but they knew it wouldn't be easy. This wasn't just about arresting a man. It was about dismantling a web of lies and power dynamics that had allowed prejudice to fester unchecked. As they entered the hotel, the sense of being watched again prickled the back of Danielle's neck. She was aware that the staff and guests were looking her way. But this time, the gazes were different. There was no judgment in their eyes. Today, they would see her as who she truly was, a federal agent, a force to be reckoned with. The lobby was as grand and pristine as it had been the day before. The marble floors reflected the elegance of the chandeliers overhead, and the soft murmur of conversations filled the air as guests wandered in and out. But this time, Danielle wasn't here to clean floors or quietly observe. She was here to confront Mr. Griffin, to expose the systemic racism that had not only affected her but was likely embedded in the hotel's entire operation. She moved through the lobby with the confidence of someone who had nothing to hide, her footsteps firm and resolute. As they approached the front desk, the familiar face of Mr. Griffin appeared in her line of sight. The moment he saw her, his face went pale, his hand shaking slightly as they gripped the edge of the reception desk. He had clearly recognized her from yesterday's humiliating encounter. "Liu, what are you doing here?" he stammered, his voice cracking with shock. Danielle didn't flinch. "I'm here to do my job," she said coolly, flashing her FBI badge with a slow, deliberate motion. The room seemed to hold its breath. The guests who had been quietly observing the scene yesterday now stared in stunned silence, their eyes darting between Danielle and Mr. Griffin. This wasn't how they had imagined their morning going, and it was clear that the situation was escalating quickly. Mr. Griffin's arrogance, however, didn't dissipate immediately. He tried to recover, his shoulders squared and his posture regaining some of the authority he had exuded earlier. You can't just come in here and—" "Mr. Griffin," Danielle interrupted, her voice cutting through his protest like a knife. "You're under arrest for racial profiling, for unlawful detention, and for violating civil rights. Your actions yesterday were recorded, and they will be used as evidence in your trial. You no longer have the power you thought you had." At her words, the entire lobby seemed to freeze. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the shuffle of footsteps as hotel staff tried to make sense of the situation. But Danielle stood firm, her eyes never leaving Mr. Griffin's face. His bravado had dissolved entirely, his eyes wide with disbelief. He opened his mouth, trying to form words, but nothing came out. I don't understand," he stammered. "This isn't possible. I didn't." "I don't need you to understand," Danielle replied. "What I need is for you to come with me, quietly. You're under arrest for your actions." Security personnel, who had been watching from the sidelines, moved in hesitantly at first, unsure of what was happening. But when they saw the badge and the force behind Danielle's presence, they complied immediately. They walked toward Mr. Griffin, their hands ready to restrain him. "Do you think this will just go away?" Mr. Griffin barked at the security guards, his voice filled with panic. "Do you know who I am?" Danielle's expression remained unreadable as she stepped forward, placing a hand on his shoulder to guide him toward the exit. "It doesn't matter who you are anymore," she said. "What matters now is that you're accountable for your actions. And the truth is, your power doesn't protect you from the law." As Mr. Griffin was escorted out of the hotel, the guests who had watched the scene unfold remained frozen in place, unable to look away. Some of them had witnessed the previous day's humiliation, and now they saw the same man who had treated Danielle with such disdain reduced to nothing more than a criminal in handcuffs. His world had come crashing down. The sense of justice that had eluded Danielle only hours before now surged within her. She hadn't just been seeking revenge for herself. She had been seeking something much greater, something that went beyond her own personal humiliation. She had taken down a man who thought he was above the law, someone who had used his position of power to demean and belittle others simply because of their race. But this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. As Danielle watched Mr. Griffin being led out of the hotel in handcuffs, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of accomplishment. He had underestimated her, and now he was paying the price for it. But she knew that the victory didn't belong to her alone. It belonged to anyone who had ever felt the sting of racial prejudice. Her actions today weren't just about making an example of Mr. Griffin. They were about showing that no one, no matter their status or power, was above the law. As the FBI team quietly filed out of the hotel, Francis looked over at Danielle, a rare, approving smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "You did good, Danielle," he said. "You did more than good. You made a statement today. And I have a feeling this isn't the last time we'll be working together on something like this." Danielle looked back at the hotel, her thoughts already racing toward the next step in the mission. "It's not over yet," she said, her voice steady, filled with resolve. "The fight isn't over. But today, we took a step in the right direction." As the team moved out, leaving behind the hotel and the aftermath of the day's events, Danielle knew this wouldn't be the last battle she fought. But with every victory, every step forward, the world would be reminded that justice, no matter how long it took, would always have the final say. The fallout. The price of power. The aftermath of Mr. Griffin's arrest spread like wildfire. Within hours, news outlets began to pick up the story, their headlines blaring the shocking events of the day. Hotel manager arrested for racial profiling. FBI agent goes undercover to expose systemic racism. As the story unfolded, the public reaction was a mix of disbelief, outrage, and support for Danielle. People were outraged that someone in a position of power could use their influence to humiliate another person based purely on their race. But what shocked them even more was the revelation that this wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a much larger pattern, one that exposed the deep-rooted prejudices that festered beneath the polished surface of high society. At the FBI's headquarters, the phone lines were buzzing with calls, many of them from outraged citizens, some from political leaders demanding answers, and others from media outlets eager to get Danielle's side of the story. But for Danielle, the phone calls and media frenzy were just noise. She had been through far worse in her career: violent criminals, undercover operations that tested her resolve. But this was different. This wasn't just about gathering intelligence or taking down a criminal network. It was about dismantling a system of prejudice that had been allowed to thrive, unchecked, for far too long. Sitting in the debriefing room at FBI headquarters, Danielle and her team went over the events in painstaking detail. The team had already reviewed the hotel's security footage, and what they found was even more damning than they had anticipated. Not only had Mr. Griffin personally humiliated Danielle, but he had also been a central figure in a series of discriminatory practices at the hotel. The footage revealed that Griffin had been involved in orchestrating situations where employees were treated unfairly based on race, and where guests had been given preferential treatment based on their wealth and appearance. Danielle sat silently as her colleagues passed around documents and photos, the weight of the situation beginning to sink in. This wasn't just about Mr. Griffin's actions. This was about a larger issue that had been festering for years. The hotel was a microcosm of a society where power and privilege often went hand in hand with discrimination. The FBI had taken down a man who thought he could abuse his position without consequence, but the larger fight was just beginning. Special Agent Francis sat across from her, his eyes focused on the documents. He had been a mentor to Danielle for years, and he understood the emotional toll the case was taking on her. "You did good, Danielle," he said quietly, looking up from his papers. "But don't forget, this isn't just about one man. We've got a bigger target now." Danielle nodded slowly. "I know. Griffin's just one piece of the puzzle. But what about the rest of them? The other managers, the staff who might have known what he was doing but turned a blind eye?" Francis sighed, leaning back in his chair. "That's what we need to find out. There's no way Griffin could have done this alone. He's part of a system, and systems like this don't just fall apart with one arrest. We need to dig deeper, follow the money, see who else is involved." As the meeting continued, Danielle's thoughts began to drift back to the hotel, back to the moments before Griffin was arrested. The sting of humiliation from the previous day had not fully left her, but there was a satisfaction that came with knowing she had not let it define her. She had faced him, looked him in the eye, and exposed him for what he truly was. The power he had wielded against her had been stripped away, and now he was facing the consequences. But the path to justice didn't end there. The media circus around Mr. Griffin's arrest escalated quickly, with interviews, opinion pieces, and investigative reports flooding the airwaves. Many journalists picked up on the broader implications of the case, connecting Griffin's actions to a larger conversation about race, class, and the abuse of power in high society institutions. Protesters took to the streets, demanding that the hotel be held accountable for its role in enabling Griffin's behavior. Calls for greater transparency in corporate policies regarding discrimination grew louder, and political leaders began issuing statements, condemning both Griffin's actions and the hotel's failure to address systemic racism within its ranks. But with the public's attention came pressure. The hotel's board of directors was forced to act quickly, and their response was swift and predictable. They fired Mr. Griffin immediately, publicly denouncing his behavior. They issued a formal apology, promising that they would undergo sensitivity training and implement new anti-discrimination policies. But even as they put on a show of contrition, it was clear to many that this was nothing more than a public relations move. They had been caught in the act, and now they were scrambling to save face. Danielle's role in the unfolding drama became the subject of media speculation. The story of the undercover FBI agent who had endured public humiliation only to turn the tables on her abuser resonated with audiences across the nation. Some viewed her as a hero, while others questioned the ethics of her undercover operation. Was it right for the FBI to use racial profiling as a tool for justice? Was this an example of overreach or a necessary step to expose the rot at the heart of a powerful institution? As the weeks went by, the legal consequences for Mr. Griffin began to unfold. He faced charges of racial discrimination, unlawful detention, and violating civil rights, and his trial became a spectacle. The media hounded him relentlessly, digging into his past and uncovering more evidence of his involvement in discriminatory practices. It became clear that Griffin's actions were not isolated incidents. They were part of a pattern that extended far beyond the walls of the hotel. He had used his position to manipulate and control, exploiting those beneath him in ways that were both subtle and overt. The legal proceedings were long and drawn out, and Danielle found herself once again in the spotlight, called to testify about the events that had transpired in the hotel lobby. She sat in a crowded courtroom, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. As she took the stand, the questions came fast and furious, both from the defense and the prosecution. They asked her about the day she was humiliated, about Mr. Griffin's behavior, about the racial profiling that had been evident from the moment she stepped into the hotel. But Danielle didn't flinch. She had already endured the worst of it. And now, It was time for the truth to come out. When it was all said and done, Mr. Griffin was found guilty of all charges, and the jury delivered a powerful statement in favor of justice. He was sentenced to prison, and his name was forever linked to the scandal that had rocked the hotel industry. But for Danielle, the victory wasn't just about the legal outcome. It was about what came next. The hotel had been forced to make real changes, implementing strict anti-discrimination policies and undergoing deep internal investigations. Employees were trained in recognizing and addressing racial bias, and the hotel worked to rebuild its reputation in the eyes of the public. And yet Danielle knew that this was only the beginning. She had faced down one man, but the battle against systemic injustice would continue. Racial profiling, prejudice, and discrimination were not problems that could be solved with one trial, one arrest, or one victory. It would take sustained effort that would require every person who cared about justice to keep pushing, to keep fighting, to keep exposing the ugly truths that often went unseen. As Danielle left the courtroom, her heart felt lighter than it had in months. The fight was far from over, but she had played a part in shifting the tide. She had exposed the truth, and in doing so, she had taken a step toward a future where people were judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. The road ahead was long, but Danielle was ready. She had learned one crucial lesson from this experience. Justice, no matter how elusive it might seem, was always worth fighting for, and she would keep fighting, one case at a time, until things truly began to change. The reflection. The weight of the truth. As the dust from the trial began to settle, Danielle took a step back to reflect on everything that had happened. She had faced a storm, a tempest of personal challenges, public scrutiny, and professional trials, but she had come out the other side victorious. The arrest of Mr. Griffin, the public outcry, the media frenzy, all of it had led to one clear outcome. Justice had been served. But for Danielle, the true impact of the events didn't sink in until the quiet moments, when the rush of adrenaline and the noise of the outside world faded away. In the days following Griffin's conviction, Danielle spent more time with her team, debriefing them on the nuances of the case. She had been part of countless undercover operations before, but this one had left an indelible mark on her. It wasn't just the personal humiliation she had endured. It was the sheer weight of the systemic issues she had uncovered. This wasn't an isolated incident. Griffin had been part of a much larger system, one that thrived on inequality, racism, and abuse of power. His actions were just the tip of the iceberg. Danielle sat in her small apartment one evening, looking out the window at the bustling city streets below. The world seemed normal again, but inside, she felt the weight of the responsibility that had been placed on her shoulders. She had been thrust into the spotlight, and now there was no going back. The world had seen her stand up to an abuser of power, but she knew the battle wasn't over. Griffin's downfall was just one chapter of a larger story. She had witnessed firsthand the way people who were different, people who looked like her, were treated in ways that no one should ever have to endure. And she had fought, not just for her own dignity, but for the dignity of everyone who had ever been judged based on the color of their skin or the way they were perceived by others. The arrest had been a victory, but the underlying issue of racial prejudice and inequality still loomed large. What was she doing now that the case had been closed? How could she continue to make a difference? Danielle found herself grappling with these questions, unsure of what her next step should be. There was a deep desire to continue fighting, to right the wrongs that so many faced every day. But how? She had always been an agent of justice, had always believed that the work she did in the field mattered. But now, she wasn't sure if that was enough. Could she really change the world just by taking down criminals one by one? Her phone buzzed, breaking her thoughts. It was a message from Special Agent Francis. "You good? It's time to start thinking about the next phase. You know we can't stop now, right?" Danielle smiled softly, reading the message. She had spent hours poring over the case, digging into every possible angle, but there was something about Francis's words that resonated with her more than anything else. He was right. She couldn't stop now. The case with Griffin had been just one small piece of the larger puzzle. What they had uncovered, what she had experienced, had opened her eyes to the fact that this fight was much bigger than her personal mission. It was about creating lasting change in a world that so desperately needed it. And so, with a deep breath, Danielle made a decision. She wasn't done. She couldn't afford to be done. The work she had done had already made an impact, but it was only the beginning. There were bigger forces at play, and she had to be a part of changing the system, not just from the inside, but from the outside as well. A few weeks later, Danielle found herself sitting in a conference room with the rest of her team. The atmosphere was serious, yet there was a palpable sense of excitement in the air. The FBI had decided to take things a step further. They weren't just going after individuals anymore. They were going after the system itself. It was time to launch a full-scale initiative to combat racial profiling and abuse of power within the institutions that perpetuated inequality. The task would be daunting, but it was a necessary next step. The initiative would involve going undercover in various organizations, from police departments to private institutions, to investigate how deeply racism and prejudice were embedded within the systems of power. It would be a long, drawn-out effort, requiring not only law enforcement, but collaboration with civil rights organizations, lawmakers, and activists who had been fighting the same battles for years. Danielle was one of the first to volunteer for the new project. She knew that her mission wasn't over. It was just evolving. As she and the team brainstormed strategies, Danielle couldn't help but think back to her time at the hotel, to the moment when she stood face to face with Mr. Griffin and exposed the ugliness behind his facade. It had been a pivotal moment, not just in her career, but in her understanding of the fight against racism. She had seen firsthand how a single act of resistance could break down the walls of prejudice. But now, the stakes were higher. The target wasn't just an individual. It was the structure that had allowed people like Griffin to thrive unchecked for so long. Her mind wandered back to the faces of the people who had witnessed Mr. Griffin's arrest. Some had looked on in shock, others with a sense of relief, as though they had witnessed the collapse of a long-standing institution of power. In their eyes, Danielle had seen hope, and that hope fueled her. It was proof that one person could make a difference. One action, one moment of defiance, could spark a change that reverberated through an entire system. Her commitment was reaffirmed with every step she took on this new journey. She wasn't just an undercover agent anymore. She was a symbol of resistance, a person who had stared down systemic injustice and made it tremble. But as she began her next mission, she realized that it wasn't just about bringing criminals to justice. It was about reshaping the very fabric of society. Weeks turned into months, and Danielle worked tirelessly alongside her team. They infiltrated organizations, gathering evidence, speaking with whistleblowers, and meeting with community leaders. But the more they uncovered, the more they realized how deep the roots of prejudice ran. It was everywhere, in the criminal justice system, in private corporations, in schools, in hospitals. Everywhere they looked, they found evidence of systemic racism and discrimination, often in the most insidious forms. But what kept Danielle going through it all was the knowledge that they were slowly making a difference. With each new case, each new revelation, they were chipping away at the power structures that perpetuated inequality. They were creating a ripple effect that was spreading across the nation, forcing people to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves and the systems they inhabited. The truth, no matter how painful, was coming to light. One afternoon, Danielle received a letter in the mail. It was a thank you note from a group of civil rights activists who had been following her story since the arrest of Mr. Griffin. The letter was simple, yet powerful. Thank you for standing up for us. Your actions gave us hope. You showed us that justice isn't just something we talk about. It's something we can fight for. And together, we will keep fighting. Danielle read the letter over and over, the weight of its words settling in her heart. She had done more than expose one man's corruption. She had inspired a movement. Her actions had reverberated far beyond the confines of her mission, touching people's lives and giving them the strength to keep fighting. The letter was a reminder of the power of truth, the importance of standing up, and the far-reaching impact that even one person's fight for justice could have. And with that, Danielle made a vow to herself to never stop fighting, to never stop pushing for change, to never let the weight of the world's injustices break her. Because, as she had learned time and time again, the fight for justice was never easy, but it was always worth it. And as long as there was breath in her lungs, Danielle would keep fighting.